So esteemed guests and colleagues, it's my honour to welcome you to the second showcase of the work of the European Centre for the Study of Hate during Research Week. And today marks a significant moment as we gather for Dr. Sindy Joyce's inaugural public lecture as the first lecturer in Traveller Studies. Joining her, we have the distinguished Professor Zoë James. Zoë James, oh my goodness. At least I didn't call you Chloe, Zoe. Professor Zoë James from the University of Plymouth, who will respond. Dr. Sindy Joyce is a scholar of Traveller Studies and a long-time advocate for her community. Sindy is active not only as an academic, but also as a human rights defender, a member of the Council of State, and a member of the committee that designed Ireland's National Anti-Racism Plan. Professor Zoë James is a criminologist renowned for her groundbreaking work in uncovering and understanding the harms of hate experienced by Gypsies, Travellers and Roma. Zoe's research has particularly explored the impacts of mobility, accommodation, policing and planning in the lived experience of travellers. In addition to being a highly published author, Zoë is also a leader in our disciplinary community. She is the co-director of the International Network for Hate Studies, chair of the British Society of Criminology Southwest Branch, and a steering group member of the British Society of Criminology Race Matters Network. She is a good friend to the ECSH, and we are delighted that she is with us today. I also want to acknowledge today Leanne McDonough and her mother, Teresa. Leanne is the incredible artist whose piece here is depicted on the banner for the Irish Travellers Access to Justice sign. And Leanne's piece, Police Presence, will also be unveiled today in the University of Limerick here on the C1 corridor after this event. If anybody would like to join us, you'd be more than welcome. I would like to extend our gratitude to the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences, Dr. Sindy Joyce, for graciously chairing this event, as well as to the faculty for their generous sponsorship. Special thanks are also due to the Assistant Dean of Research, Tina Moran, for her unwavering support for our work. We would also like to extend our thanks to the Research Office, particularly to Yvonne Kiley, for their dedication and their efforts in making this week possible. This event holds immense significance as it celebrates and underscores the importance of advancing scholarship in Traveller Studies and combating hate and prejudice in all its forms. It serves as a testament to UL's commitment to fostering inclusivity, understanding and empathy within academia and beyond. So without further ado, let's delve into today's event.
Thank you, Amanda. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so thank you everybody for coming here today. So I'm just going to begin my lecture. So as people know, throughout history and persisting today, Ireland's oldest and only Indigenous ethnic community, Minkar Pavi Traveller community, has been subjected to continuous persecution, colonisation and cultural genocide. Consisting of just 0.7% of the general population of Ireland, the community has previously and continues to suffer from direct, structural and symbolic violence, which has resulted in increased mortality rates, with just 5% of Minkers living beyond the age of 65. Infant mortality is 4 times higher than the general population, and suicide rates are 7 times higher, with a shocking 11% of the community dying from suicide alone. It is recognised that there is a disproportionate overrepresentation of the Minkeri community in Irish prison, accounting for 10% of the male prisoner population and 15% of the female prison population. These alarming statistics are not unique to Ireland. For example, Indigenous people in Canada make up over 30% of the prison population, despite comprising of just 5% of the general population. In Australia, Indigenous people represent 30% of the population, while only consisting of 3.8% of the general population. And in New Zealand, over 50% of the prison population are Indigenous, while comprising of just 16% of the general population. So behind these traumatising statistics, we see a historical, systemic process of Indigenous peoples being constructed as the problem population, where the focus is on their criminal behaviour rather than connecting the systemic attacks, breaches of human rights, and the obliteration of traditional ways of life, along with the suppression of culture, language, and identity crimes committed against them. To quote Professor Cunnan, human rights apparently had nothing to do with their offending behaviour. Indigenous peoples the world over have been subjected to state policies with a disproportionate impact on their overrepresentation in the prison system. However, prison is just one form of exclusion in a world of policies and practices of assimilation, where people are marginalised to the outskirts of society and experience profound socio-economic disadvantage. When we look at the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples with the criminal justice system, it is important for us to take into account the consideration and the context of the experiences of Indigenous peoples, and to take into account the overall general criminalisation of these communities through forced assimilation and continuous human rights violations, including cultural genocide, along with the criminalisation of cultural activities and institutionalised racism. Core to the identification of indigeneity is self-identification. So although it was not until 2017 that Minkeri were formally recognised as an Indigenous ethnic community, Minkeri and Pavis have always argued that this has been the case. We have self-determined our identity long ago. Among international law and scholars alike, there is no agreed definition to the term of Indigenous. Instead, the United Nations rely on a set of principles. Within these principles, the United Nations consider two types of people: Indigenous and tribal peoples. The two terms are used interchangeably and are used because there are tribal peoples who are not Indigenous in the literal sense in the countries in which they live, but who nonetheless live in a similar situation and suffer similar circumstances. Many of these peoples refer to themselves as Indigenous, and the United Nations captures both groups under the Indigenous principles. When applying these principles, it can be argued that Minkeri Pavis meet the criteria of indigeneity. Irish travellers could be recognised as an Indigenous people with a right to self-determination. According to the census 2023, there were 40,000 Minkeri in the Republic of Ireland. In the north, there were about 3,000, and in the UK, it's much more complicated, as we have conflated communities between Gypsy, Roma, and travellers there. Irish travellers are referenced in Irish oral history from the earliest of times, with references to Fer Siúl and Mná Siúl. According to MacLachlan, the first mention of Irish travellers was in the 5th century, where they were referred to as whitesmiths, due to their association with the occupation of tinsmithing. The historical denial of traveller ethnicity has permitted state institutions and authorities to either deliberately or subconsciously render the historical presence of travellers and traveller history and culture invisible on the one hand, and a conflict to settled society on the other. Rather than recognising travellers as an Indigenous distinct ethnic group in Irish society, as evidenced in the 1963 report of the Commission on Itinerancy, the Irish government policy was assimilation into the settled society. Indeed, in his address to the Commission, the then Minister for Justice, Charles Haughey, stated that there can be no final solution to the problems created by itinerants until they are absorbed into the general community. Excuse me. So when we look at the general community. So specifically, it noted that itinerance into the general community needed to be assimilated. Globally, clashes of culture between nomadic and sedentary populations have a long history of where nomadic peoples were seen as a propertyless people and had no right to be included within the political or the moral structures of society. The clash between settled and nomadic populations is often at the root cause of violent confrontations and conflicts, and time again at the heart of this conflict and confrontation is the issue of the sharing of lands between nomadic and sedentary populations. Although nomadic peoples are unattached to the land in the concept of ownership, they are exceptionally attached to the territory, to their nomadic roots and their nomadic identities. It is still a vital part of their expression of culture, even if nomadism has been criminalised and the vast majority can no longer practice it. So these United Nations principles of indigeneity link to the criteria of cultural distinctiveness and difference, and the dominance of settled society and Ireland's sedentarised institutions and systems has resulted in Minkeri being othered in Irish society, excluded and marginalised. Irish travellers live and navigate a sedentarised world as a condition of existence. As a traditionally nomadic people, Minkeri are often seen as a problem community in conflict with sedentarised society, and as non-conformative to the settled way of life, which is at the odds with their cultural identity and traditional way of life. Within the government's 1963 report of the Commission on Itinerancy, the Commission argued that itinerants, or travellers as they prefer to be called themselves, they stated, do not constitute a single group, tribe or community within the nation, although the settled people are inclined to regard them as such. The experiences of assimilation and forced settlement and marginalisation compels Minkeri to live the realities of trauma, including intergenerational trauma, due to the wider colonising societal pressures to conform to the dominant sedentary society. Vanessa Hayslip uses a virtual representation of the impact of colonisation of Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities, adapted from the work of Matthews and Cunningham and Stanley on other Indigenous communities. And when we look at this graph, we can see the process and the circle of colonisation for the Gypsy, Roma and traveller community. And when we look at the loss of culture and the loss of lifestyle and the impact that has through the historical trauma, domestic violence, increased mental health illness, unemployment, poverty, poor education, marginalisation and poor communication and discrimination. So the principles also focus on distinct social systems, language, culture, traditions and beliefs. Minkeri have a separate social system based on culture, beliefs and language, which is connected to their historical nomadic existence. The dominant sedentarised system represents a society which reflects the settled population's cultural perspective and does not capture or accommodate the Minkeri cultural perspective and history. Cultural values are enshrined in family and oral traditions where teaching and history is passed down from one generation to the next, which provides the community with the resilience to survive with their identity intact and to survive to self-preserve culture, despite regressive state policies. Nevertheless, many Minkeri Irish travellers feel that their culture is being forcibly eradicated by the dominant societal culture and practices of settled society, a process perceived as having disturbing outcomes, such as becoming settled, or what is now become to be termed as a settled traveller, where there is a sense that they are being ethnically cleansed. Vanessa Hayslip states that this forcible eradication of culture destroys people's political, socio-cultural and economic security, which results in the loss of language, connections with land and vital cultural practices, which is a form of cultural genocide. Robbie McVeigh describes the official response to travellers as a state policy of assimilation and cultural genocide. Since the 1948 Genocide Convention does not recognise cultural genocide and it renders it invisible, cultural genocide was a key element in Lemkin's concept of genocide, the inclusion of what was opposed aggressively by the colonial powers to avoid implicating themselves in the crimes of genocide. An element of cultural genocide is historical trauma, defined as the cumulative emotional and psychological trauma occurred over generations, something which is clearly evident in the Minkar community. By analysing the United Nations principles on Indigenous peoples, it can be argued that Irish travellers can claim indigeneity under the criteria. I'm getting mixed up with my words now, excuse me. So over the last decade or so, and across all disciplines and sectors of society, we have seen a shift where the discourse of human rights has gained some attention and recognition. Within the fields of humanities, human rights and discussions have brought new perspectives into how we view the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the state. And even more importantly, human rights have emerged as a fundamental tool and a platform for people to actively lobby and campaign for more inclusive policies that recognise and undo the wrongs committed against them, and to celebrate their culture, identity, and their contribution to the state. With this development, the discipline of criminology and social sciences are experiencing a notable shift where Indigenous knowledge and understandings bring a much-needed Indigenous perspective to the field. The narrative of the Indigenous problem, or indeed the traveller problem, as it is called here in Ireland, has been a dominant narrative where experiences of the criminal justice system have a focus on the communities as criminals, rather than as victims of crime. Professor Chris Cunning asserts that there are three strands in how we might bring criminology to a more intellectually robust understanding of Indigenous people and human rights. Indigenous peoples have been victims of profound historical injustice and abuses of human rights, which can be at least partially understood as state crime. Contemporary justice systems are often seen in the context of the abuse of Indigenous peoples' human rights. And an analysis of how claims of Pacific Indigenous rights impact on current criminal justice processes and how those claims might broaden our understandings of reform and change. The historical absence of human rights and the harm perspective within criminology is coined as epistemological blindness, a concept termed by Santos, in which Indigenous issues are excluded, resulting in academic bias and gaps, where the discipline is dominated by non-Indigenous scholars who consciously or unconsciously decide on what matters and is informed by many consequential biases. Guys and South suggest the need to reorientate the criminological compass by widening its focus to include peoples and issues that are frequently excluded. They call for the inclusion of Indigenous issues and voices on the criminological agenda, conceptuality, theoretically, and methodology through three propositions. First, such inclusion could generate important academic knowledge about the dynamics behind breaches of human rights attributed to Indigenous peoples and other crimes against them. Second, considering the global conceptualisation of rights and crimes are primarily Western and can thus be considered colonial, criminologists attuned to the principles of xenonology can unearth hidden legal and silent yet harmful forces that threaten the survival of Indigenous peoples in the long run. Third, more engagement with Indigenous criminology could unearth knowledge that is currently unfamiliar to criminologists and could be valuable and inspirational in the development of new strategies for crime prevention, harm reduction and restorative justice in non-Indigenous communities and societies, as well as being instructive about the limitations of physical punishments which are employed. As traditionally nomadic people, Mincery have faced extreme persecution, confinement and detainment. In Ireland, anti-nomadic legislation was introduced by the British during the 1500s, which penalised and criminalised nomadic lives and presented travellers as rogues and criminals, reflecting the bias of the sedentary population. However, the persecution of Mincery in Ireland cannot be ascribed in its entirety to outside forces. From the early days of the Free State, the Irish government began a long process of ideological and political racialisation which focused on state building and reinventing the national identity and culture. In the formation of the Irish state, the colonial othering of Mincery was adapted to support the process of building a national identity. Such othering perpetuated views of travellers that persisted from the colonial times and were reimagined and reinvigorated during the formation of the Irish state. Mincery are intrinsically linked to the very concept of Irish identity. They are simultaneously the same and the other. It is argued that the creation of otherness stems from Ireland's colonial history, where the British regulated to Irish being othered as a colonial minority, as they did to other Indigenous peoples. According to Michael O'Hada, following the achievement of independence in 1921 to 22, these negative constructs of Irish people were simply transferred to the new community, the Irish travellers, where we became the new other in Irish society. And anti-traveller policies and prejudice flowed from this time. However, travellers have always been a distinct, unique community within both British and Irish societies. Theories coming from the Enlightenment, European philosophy and social sciences contributed to the domination of nomadic societies, which justified the marginalisation of nomadic groups, including Mincery. Othering is linked to the formation of the new state, to the new mediating preoccupation of previously colonised people with the question of their own self-definition. The Irish state continued to exclude Mincery from the national identity up until the 1960s, when they introduced the national state assimilation policy and settlement policy. The original concept of genocide, as introduced by Raphael Lemkin, gave cultural genocide a central stage. He described it as an attempt to destroy a group and its culture. For Lemkin, the very essence of genocide was and is cultural as well as biological. Yet the final text of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide does not prohibit cultural genocide as such, as it is limited to physical and biological destruction. In more recent times, cultural genocide has come to be associated more closely with Indigenous rights movements, where it has become a tool for naming the actions of both colonial and post-colonial governments to sections of their own population, in order to assimilate groups into majority population and create a degree of cultural sameness. Without being tied down by the strict limitations of the concept of genocide in international law, the concept of cultural genocide allows for Indigenous communities to describe governmental actions through the terminology of genocide. The denial of traveller ethnicity, the criminalisation of nomadism, and the oppression of culture has amounted to policies equating to what can be termed as cultural genocide. For example, state documents such as the 1963 report of the Commission on Itinerancy, the state identified difference and a distinct culture as a problem for Irish society and not conforming to the norm, as a challenge to the sovereignty of the state. The Housing Miscellaneous Act Miscellaneous Act 2002 made trespass a criminal offence, allowing local authorities to evict travellers indiscriminately without having to fulfil their responsibilities to provide alternative accommodation, essentially criminalising nomadism, making it illegal for travellers to camp on unofficial land not authorised by the state. And such legislation and other attempts to assimilate travellers are described by Kitchin as a form of cultural genocide. Globally, clashes of culture, as stated above, classes of culture between nomadic and sedentary populations have a long history where violence and conflict were prominent. Nomads were and are othered and viewed in society with suspicion, and in most societies today, nomadic peoples face discrimination. At the heart of this discrimination lies the crucial issue of property and land. The sharing of lands between nomads and the settled agricultural societies have often led to violent confrontations. Access to land is a determining factor in many nomadic peoples' lives, as whether or not nomads have access to land will determine the survival of their nomadic identities and lifestyles. Historically, nomadic peoples have not been regarded as having any rights to land because their nomadic lifestyle was not considered to fulfill the criteria of effective occupation of the land. According to Casnuff, since the dawn of mankind, there has been a violent confrontation between the two lifestyles, the settled and the nomadic way of life. The clash between settled and nomadic populations is often at the root cause of violent conflicts and the sharing of lands between the nomadic and sedentary peoples. Compare the international practices in which European states engaged in. From around the year of 1500, Europeans came to invade and occupy lands such as the Americas, Asia, and Africa. And at the end of the 19th century, only a handful of non-colonised parts of the world remained. The question was, with what right people outside of Europe were deprived of their land? In his 1532 publication, the Spanish scholar Francisco de Verto argued that God had given human beings the earth in order to cultivate it, and that land which lays fallow legitimately can be appropriated. The British and others were quick to use this to their own advantage. Wherever they went in their travels, they discovered what they called uninhabited lands, not cultivated by anyone. And wherever they did, and they declared themselves ready and able and willing to carry out God's plan of cultivating the land. Nowhere in the Americas or in Africa or Asia were there any fences, they argued, and they argued that no property fences and hence no property rights. The legal arguments were the basis for a sharp distinction between people of three different kinds, what they called civilized people, barbarians, and savages. The civilized people were Europeans, of course, while barbarians were people who lived in the kingdoms of Asia, people who had a state, but a state that was very different kind of a state to the Europeans. Savages, finally stated, were those who lived in a condition of statelessness. As a result of this theory of effective occupation of lands, nomadic peoples have been regarded as legally non-existent. They were perceived as not being civilized enough to have a right to occupy their lands in relation to the rules governing title to territory, and the agricultural argument resulted in the belief that territories inhabited by nomadic and indigenous peoples were empty and open to conquest or discovery. This failure to recognise nomadic peoples as potential effective occupiers of the lands is based on the diffuse but the persistent belief that because nomadic peoples are continuously moving from place to place, they do not really occupy the lands as such. The view that nomadic peoples are not attached to any particular place has developed, despite the work of modern anthropologists, criminologists, and sociologists, which proves how nomadic peoples have developed spiritual ties and social and spatial boundaries to specific territories in their lands. Sociologists observe that no nomadic population wanders aimlessly and randomly. Evidence from both Indigenous and sociological studies proves that for generations, nomadic peoples have developed very strong ties within their territories. In Ireland, anti-nomadic legislation was introduced, as I stated, during the 1500s, and distinct boundaries between the settled community and the traveller community were set from the very foundation of the state. Minkeri were framed within an opposing political and social discourse where Minkeri were seen as a failed settled people on the one hand and a distinct nomadic cultural group on the other. Derogatory terms such as tinker and itinerant were commonly used to describe us, and we were frequently termed as a nuisance to settled society. The creation of a monocultural Irish identity was beneficial for the Irish nation building process, where group difference was not valued, and a state was created by the dominant settled majority for the settled majority. Just 6 months after the founding of the state, on the 8th of June 1923, the Galway Urban District Council issued a general order to remove tinkers from the area. This removal of Minkeri was repeated across the nation and has continued right up to this very day. Such representations perpetrated views of travellers that persisted from colonial times, and to civilise and to make us into useful citizens, the following decades concentrated on the aim of the 1963 report of the Commission on Itinerancy, which was the ideological process of settlement and assimilation, which was the solution to their strong opposition to nomadism. So the overrepresentation of ethnic and minority communities in prison, it's a phenomenon in many national and international prison systems. In Ireland, failures of the criminal justice system for Minkeri are manifested in numerous ways, but perhaps the most notable and extreme is the overrepresentation of travellers in the prison system as offenders. Irish traveller women are 22 times more likely to be imprisoned than non-traveller women, and Irish traveller men are between 5 and 11 times more likely to be imprisoned than non-traveller men. The framing of Minkeri as destructive criminals and as a problem in Irish society has created a relationship of mistrust and concern. The research Irish Travellers' Access to Justice that I did with my colleagues, Professor Amanda Haynes and Professor Jennifer Strepp, along with Olive O'Reilly and Margaret O'Brien and David Joyce, was the Irish Travellers' Access to Justice research. It concerned itself with travellers' access to justice, where we said access to justice means having the ability to use the tools of the legal system to protect your rights. In understanding access to justice, we used the GRAD's recommendations on access to justice for national minorities, the Global Access to Justice Project, and the New Zealand Law Society model of centred access to justice. We think that what is key is that the justice system and those working in it are trusted by travellers, that travellers understand their rights, that travellers are aware of their rights, travellers are accessible, there are accessible processes and supports for travellers to have their rights protected, and people are heard and people are treated fairly and respectfully. When we look at the relationship between travellers and the Irish criminal justice system, it looks more like mistrust than trust. As a stigmatised ethnic community and suspectified community, Minkeri have a history of difficult relations with the institutions of the criminal justice. Although our research related to the period from 2016 to 2021, some of our respondents raised their own negative childhood experiences with the criminal justice system, particularly the Gardaí, as an obstacle to building trust. In the present day, respondents described their own children's mistrust of the criminal justice system, and it seems little has changed today. In understanding the character of mistrust, it is worth noting that travellers in this research most commonly characterise their attitudes towards Gardaí as one of fear. And also in understanding the character of this mistrust, travellers in this research commonly characterise their attitudes towards judges as one of fear. Only a small number of travellers think that the Gardaí and the courts were effective in either tackling crime generally or crime against the travellers specifically. Travellers are more than twice as likely to think that the Gardaí are effective in tackling crime generally compared to the crime against travellers. So 40% of the Irish Travellers Access to Justice respondents agreed that the Gardaí are effective in tackling crime generally, while only 17% agreed that they are effective in tackling crime against travellers. So clearly there is a significant task ahead of the state in addressing these gaps in trust between the general population and the traveller community. The gaps in trust are deep and extensive, and given that research suggests that they are also long-standing, trust building will require engagement, commitment, consistency and time. As this research shows, travellers' mistrust in the criminal justice system is not a groundless perception. It is informed by experience, and therefore it is those experiences that must be addressed. The EU is part of the international process of promoting and protecting Indigenous people's rights, and in recent years the EU has moved from a relatively passive position regarding recognition of Indigenous people's rights to a much more active involvement in ensuring the effectiveness of these rights in its policies. The European Union has been actively supporting Indigenous peoples since the late 1990s and has committed itself to maintain Indigenous peoples as a focus of attention, given their disadvantage in all societies. However, saying that, just 5 members of the EU states have ratified the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention 1989. These states are Denmark, the Netherlands, Spain, Luxembourg and Germany. The Sami community are the only recognised Indigenous group in Europe, and according to Trudel, Hemilski and Kaskaner, unlike most Indigenous peoples in the post-colonial world, Sami people don't live in extreme poverty and aren't exposed to high levels of violence. But they do have a history of colonisation and discrimination, and tend to not have an easy relationship with the 4 modern states that they inhabit, although Sami people still do face significant threats today. The development of Indigenous criminology has provided a framework for analysing the significant overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in criminal justice systems in the USA, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. Criminology studies informed by Indigenous criminology in those countries have begun to recognise the importance of the settler colonial contexts of the study of Indigenous peoples and crime. European countries, although not settler societies in the sense that it's applied to North America, Australia and New Zealand, also have Indigenous communities that have been subjected to similar processes of cultural and linguistic suppression, criminalisation of ways of life and attempts at forced assimilation. In contrast to Professor Pat Carlin's call for criminology to be identified as a scientific art, Indigenous people's view for criminology is to hold the settler colonial state accountable for the violence that it perpetrates against Indigenous people, and to subject Western criminologists to critical scrutiny for their historical and contemporary support for the state. Coonan and Torrey have recently identified a number of issues that require the theoretical and empirical attention to the evolving Indigenous criminology movement. Paramount is the development and empirical investigation of a theory of colonisation, of the impact of colonial and neo-colonial policies of settler colonial government on Indigenous communities. Also of importance for an Indigenous critique of crime control policies is the reinvigoration of Indigenous social and political activism, such as Canada's Idle No More movement. The ongoing battle of members of the Indigenous Academy to centre Indigenous experiences, knowledges and methodologies are essential to the criminological explorations of the Indigenous world. Criminology, human rights and Indigenous peoples. How do we understand the connections between these 3 terms? For too long, the voices arguing to connect criminology with human rights were isolated and marginalised, At best, the possible links were seen to the main concerns of criminology, and at worst between a human rights understanding of the definitions of crime and criminal justice was seen as undermining criminology's search for scientific status. As for Indigenous people, they were seen as part of the crime problem, a segment of the population, of the problem population, whose criminality needed explanation. Human rights, apparently, had nothing to do with their offending. Thank you.
Congratulations, Sindy, on a very thought-provoking lecture there. There was a talk there. There was so much richness there, and even though I've heard those statistics many times, they still bite every time, don't they? They really are shocking. And you know, you gave us some wonderful quotes as well from your research that you've done, which is really adding so much richness, I suppose, to that. The expression of those experiences, which is so important as well. So thank you so much for that. My own background is music, and there's a huge disconnect in traditional music, which is where my heart is, between how we venerate travellers and the contribution that they've made to the culture of this country. Massively, massively appreciated. But then the reality of travellers' lives. So I suppose that's something that I've always been conscious of as well in my own work. So, but thank you so much for that. I just want to pay tribute as well to the Centre, the European Centre for the Study of Hate, and our two colleagues, Professor Jennifer Schwepp and Professor Amanda Haynes, and all the work they've done there with Dr. Sindy Joyce, and also Irish Travellers Access to Justice as an amazing project as well. We're so fortunate to have this work going on in our faculty. So I'd like to invite Zoe now to come and join us and to maybe give us a response. Would you like to do it here first?
Yes,
yeah, perfect.
Cool.
So please welcome Zoe. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I feel very privileged to be here today and to have just listened to Sindy's inaugural public lecture, which was fantastic in both real terms and in academic terms, I think. I think it spoke on both levels, which is extremely difficult to do. As Amanda introduced me. Apologies, Amanda. I'm a professor of criminology at the University of Plymouth in the UK, and I've been very lucky to come to Limerick a few times and work with Professor Haynes and Professor Schwepp and the Centre for the Study of Hate. And to be introduced to Sindy some time ago. So I was very lucky to be Sindy's external examiner for her PhD. And it's one of my career highs, I would argue, because I was able to witness Sindy bring her ideas and her work and her academic professionalism to light, and to become the first traveller in Ireland with a PhD, and then go on to become the first lecturer in traveller studies. And I have no Gypsy traveller or Roma heritage, and I see my job as having worked in this area for 25 years. I keep saying 25 years, it's increasing all the time. But to, look to young scholars and to highlight the work of young scholars from those communities that I've been working with. And if I've learned anything over the years as an academic, it is that the most important thing we have to remember to do is to keep our ears open, to keep our minds open to new and innovative ways of thinking about the world. Because it's very easy to become entrenched into an academic position. You've got a good idea and you're going to stick with it. But actually, by keeping your ears open, by reading new things, what you do is you're constantly learning and you're constantly developing. And when I read through Sindy's work for this piece, I found it really interesting and really innovative, interesting, exciting to read, because it was reflecting a lot of the work that I do and have been doing with some of my other early career researchers. And I think that push in criminology to start to explore indigeneity to a deeper level, to understand indigeneity from the perspective of the Indigenous communities, has been incredibly important in recent years. And I've been lucky enough to do some work with Chris Caneen, who's been pushing this from the Australian context particularly. And I think that we need to be looking at human rights from that Indigenous perspective, but from the perspective of historical trauma that Sindy spoke about. And the fact that that trauma is embedded in multiple sites, in the person, but also in the community, in the wider community's expressions and experiences, and sometimes their perception of conflict and how conflict can be managed. It's a very natural response to put up barriers when you're constantly attacked and to struggle to engage with people trying to apparently help, you know? And we need to think about that in the sense of a trauma perspective. We need to acknowledge how trauma impacts all aspects of people's lives, from their personal life, their social life, their family life, and their cultural life. And how, especially for communities that have oral histories, how that is passed through intergenerationally. So I was really, really pleased to hear Sindy talk about historical trauma and to acknowledge that historical trauma in the way that she did. I also feel it's really, really important that we talk a lot about from the perspective of communities. So Sindy is able to talk about her community. And in the UK, across Europe, and also across the world, but I'm going to focus on the European experience at the moment, we've fallen into a trap of conflating gypsies, travellers, and Roma. And often in the European mainland context, really only talking about Roma, as if there's a community of people who are Roma, like this homogenous community. And that's not a reality. There are multiple peoples who have Roma identities, which are complex, different, Indigenous in some countries, not in others, mobile in some places, not mobile in others. There are Indigenous travellers in Ireland. In the UK, we have Indigenous Scots and Scottish and Welsh travellers. And I would actually argue that we have English travellers, but that's a piece of work that I'm currently working on with colleagues. We're really interested in how Romani people came to the UK, but we're also interested in Roma communities and Irish travellers and all of the different people who make up this kind of group that we keep shoving together in a very paternalistic and patronising fashion, that I would argue. And I think it's really important that we do take a step back and we listen to those communities and we hear their voices. I have a PhD student at the moment who Amanda and Jennifer both know and work with also, called Fernando, who's Spanish, and he's Spanish Roma man. And he is equally passionate about the Spanish experience and the uniqueness of the Spanish experience and the imposition of the Roma banner in the way that it's meted out through some European policies. And he's respectful and embraces some aspects of those human rights recognitions. But at the same time, he's frustrated by the imposition of a patronising approach. So I kind of wanted to mention that because I think there's a lot of similarities there, and I think it's really important. We at least, sometimes we need to conflate identities in order to present statistics and stories and similarities and to identify solidarity. That's hugely important. But sometimes we need to unpack and we need to be recognise the different communities that we're talking about. I've recently done a large piece of research in the UK, which is very similar to the Irish Travellers' Access to Justice study, and we've found some really interesting, tragically similar results. So we did a large survey of gypsies and travellers, not Roma, but gypsies and travellers in England, and we did that with all of the different gypsy and traveller communities who self-identified in the survey. We also did a load of very long oral histories with people. But I want to just sort of highlight some of the survey findings that we have that are really, really comparative. And what we found in our survey of 400 people nationally was that rates of victimisation of those communities, not race-related victimisation, but just standard crimes against those people, were extremely high, so double the normal rate, no matter where those gypsies or travellers lived. So whether they lived in insecure accommodation or secure accommodation, be it on site or in bricks and mortar accommodation, we found that 46% of the gypsies and travellers we surveyed had experienced a crime in the last 12 months. And that was across 22-23. And we also found, which just is shocking, we found that 11% of the gypsies and travellers we surveyed had experienced a hate crime, so a crime on the basis of their gypsy or traveller identity. And that was 10 times the highest rate of any other ethnic minority community. So even the highest rate of racist hate crime against other communities was 10 times lower than for gypsies and travellers in England in our survey. And what we found was that Irish travellers were experiencing the highest proportion of hate crime, so the highest proportion of racist crimes against them. And associated with that, we found extremely high rates of, extremely low rates of trust in the police. So again, really reflecting Sindy's findings and research from the Irish Travellers' Access to Justice research, but also all of her other work. And what this highlights is that this is a shared problem for gypsies and travellers across our islands. This is something we all need to be fighting against. This is something we all need to be talking about and highlighting. This is extraordinary comparative to other communities. When we think about racist hate crime, we think about people of colour. We don't tend to think of gypsies and travellers, who are commonly placed within the white population. And we need to be talking about it, we need to highlighting it, and similar to Sandra, you still get that intake of breath. And I have told lots of people, you can imagine, about this research over the last few months since we did the analysis. It still makes me go when I say it. I think it was really interesting in your talk that you went back in time. And this is something, again, that I'm really excited about, your work and some of the contemporary work around Indigenous criminology. Because we need to go back in time and we need to think about how we got to where we are and how boundaries have been laid in the way they have been. How and why we see mobility and attachment to land in the way that we do, and how the values are structured that create the norms in our society. There is some really, really interesting work around how land has been monetised and how value has been placed on that, the monetarisation of land through agriculture and that failure to acknowledge the stopping places. And that's for, as you say, Irish travellers in Ireland, but also in the UK in relation to Romany gypsies and the Achintans and the traditional stopping places of Romany gypsies. So that attachment to land, the closure of land, and the bounding of space and that association with notions of civilization are so long in our history that we do need to go beyond thinking about the colonial project. We need to acknowledge how the colonial project has impacted, but acknowledge how far we need to look back to appreciate the origins of this situation that we find ourselves in. And I take a semiological approach often in my work. I'm interested in harm, and I think one of the ways in which we can truly, as criminologists, appreciate and understand how Gypsies, travellers and Roma have experienced the harms of hate and the harms of exclusion and colonialism is through taking that lens, and appreciating that we can't be thinking in simple, bounded notions of crime alone. And so it behoves me to turn to our early career researchers, to Sindy, to Fernando, my PhD student, but also to the many upcoming traveller criminologists that we can support and shout out for and open the doors for, to say, please do more scholarship, please come to us and be supported by us. We need to facilitate Indigenous scholars, and we need to be thinking about how that work informs our work through an open mind, rather than through a closed mind of I've decided I am taking this approach that was created in 1972 by some white man. We need to think, why are we thinking that way? Do we need to think differently? Okay, thank you.
This is being recorded, so just to say that, would anybody like to make any comments or ask any questions at this stage? Just like to throw it open to yourselves. Amanda.
Thank you both so much. That was so interesting. And to hear the kind of framework of Indigenous criminology brought into European perspective, it's really useful. Beyond all else, it is really useful. What I wanted to ask you was, I suppose when you look at the work of people like Conine and Towery, and when you look at some of the people working in Canada as well, part of Indigenous criminology is about trying to move beyond the harms, which are incredibly important to document and to understand, but to move towards other ways of doing things, particularly by trying to incorporate tradition-based approaches to justice into how we do justice now. I am struck that in a European context, I'm just not seeing literature, and please tell me if I'm missing something, but on tradition-based systems of justice kind of outside of Scandinavia. And is it the length of the period of colonization? Is it the extensiveness and depth of the cultural genocide? Or, you know, has that been lost to us? Or is that a type of scholarship that may become part of this Indigenous criminology project in Europe as we go forward?
Tanya? Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Amanda. Yeah, I think that you're absolutely correct there. There isn't any specific literature or field based around that. But I suppose there's two senses to that, in the fact that the deep cultural genocide that has been perpetrated against the traveller community has kind of permitted the historical traditions and practices as invisible into societies. And I think that's not just in Ireland, I think it's across Europe when you're looking at the nomadic communities in Europe and the persecution that was faced, not just through the criminalisation of the practice of their cultural identity, such as the nomadic practice, but people like the Roma community experiencing things like slavery, the Holocaust, and those historical tragedies that they have faced, but also the fact that if you look at not just, I suppose, the traditional practices of conflict, but if you look at all the practices, even outside of criminology, if you looked at all the practices, say, in religion, health, in how we deal with, I suppose, that intergenerational trauma that we experience, how we deal with that as a community, that is not, it's not seen outside of the community. It has not been documented. And part of that is because of the persecution, but also the neglect of traveller history and culture being identified in the historical literature and sources. Zoe?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a big gap, especially in the academic literature. I mean, there's some really amazing Roma rights work in all over, places like Hungary, etc. There's some incredible work, but it is oriented within the practitioner sphere rather than in the academic sphere. I'm really lucky that I had a professor at the University of Plymouth who did a lot of work in this area, and he had the best name of a criminologist ever because he was Professor Blagg. Harry Blagg, and he is now emeritus professor in Australia and I'm trying to remember where he is, but I can't remember, sorry. But he has done loads of work around restorative approaches through Indigenous Aboriginal communities and working with Pacific Islanders. And I know Wantauri has done that as well, and have done some, I've had some really great conversations with Wantauri about those solidarities with other, with the communities that I work with the traveller community, etc. So I think there is some really good stuff to pull on there, but unfortunately I think that the academy needs to ensure that it is supportive of that work rather than, because it's not exactly, it's not, huge money-making work. It's not hugely, it relies on a lot of really pure qualitative methodology. And that a lot of this does need that in order to represent that historical trauma, etc. And the academy needs to be mindful of what it supports and ensures that it does open up those doors to slightly different approaches. Yeah, does that answer the question? Thank you.
We're nearly out of time. I don't see any other questions, but I have I have a question that is not quick. It probably would take several generations to answer, but uncovering those historical voices, it sometimes bothers me that we have many voices historically that have been silenced, and I mean that's a very, very difficult thing to do, but I think it's necessary to make an effort. But when things aren't documented and when voices aren't heard in history, I don't know if you wanted to comment briefly on that. It's
I suppose. Is that a question?
Generations, yes. I'll tie it down a bit more. So we've had, your talk was so insightful on many aspects of, I suppose, the history of this country. We've been talking about the European history, and there are many instances of genocide, but often the voices at the centre of that are silenced. And I'm just wondering, I suppose just if you'd like to comment a little bit on the challenges of trying to uncover those voices.
So you are right. They have been silent and silenced, and I think I think we have a duty to uncover those voices that has been hidden in history and society, but also outside of that duty, I think that society itself has a duty to right the wrongs that has been done to those people that have been silenced, but also to recognise that when we are asking people to give their experiences of trauma and their experiences of particularly cultural trauma, when it is broad across the community, that we need to remember that we are bringing up those traumatic experiences again, because many communities, including the Mink Area community, they're communities that are living in grief, a continuous cycle of grief, and I suppose it's really important to, I suppose, like a lot of people say, I suppose, and I probably Leanne gets it as well, like that you're speaking for the community or things like that, but I'm not speaking for the community. I'm speaking from my own experiences and from my family experiences and from what the community tell me. So I'm speaking not for the community, but the community are telling me these experiences. So I'm speaking the community's voice as such, not my own kind of. If that kind of answers your question. It does need kind of generations to answer that, but we just don't have that time today.
And all I would say is that I think one of the things that Sindy does in that paper is that she identifies where the gaps are. And actually, we talk about hearing people's voices, and I get your point that those voices have been taken out. But if you can identify the negation, then that is the key, because you can very clearly see in historical documents that negation, or the different terms, as you were saying, to different communities, etc. And so identifying the gaps is as important as, hearing the actual voices, which you can keep gathering now, and you can go back in records and look at archives, and you can use as much as you possibly can, and the stories that have been told down through generations, as you say, and I think, so for me, that's the really important thing.
Thank you so much. Yes, Leanne. Here, you like, oh, it won't stretch, I'm afraid.
Just in direct response to that, I know it would take generations to answer that question, right? But it reminded me of something I did recently with a colleague of mine in Scotland who happened to be a Scottish traveller. And they were responding to the unheard voices of different communities, and I thought it was a really interesting project that I had the pleasure of working in. They searched the archives and brought forward a number of voices of people who had been summoned to court and tried for certain things. And there was this one woman who was a Scottish traveller, Agnes MacDonald was her name, and she was sentenced to death because they claimed she was a witch for practicing herbalism. But what they did was they asked a number of artists to take their stories and to breathe life into them. And the work that came out of that, a number of people who responded, was an amazing exhibition that was held in Blackness Castle. And I'm just thinking, if we're thinking about different approaches and how to bring life to these unheard voices, artists are normally a good place to start.
I hear you and I'm with you. You're singing the same song as myself. No, I think that's a really important point. Thank you so much, Leanne. Okay, I don't know if there's any other questions or queries, or questions or comments, but I want to thank everybody involved in today. Again, to Professor Haynes, to Professor Schwepp, to everybody, to the Research Office, Yvonne, everybody who's been involved in this event. A very special thank you to Professor James for travelling here today and for contributing so much. Thank you so much, Zoe. And of course, the last and very special thank you is to our wonderful colleague, Dr. Sindy Joyce. I often get mistaken for her, but our names are very similar. But I think we're very lucky to have Sindy here in UL, and thank you for sharing your insights with us today. So thank you, Sindy.